There comes a moment in life when the noise begins to fade. The ambitions that once drove you, the people you once chased, the dreams you thought would complete you, they slowly lose their grip. And in that silence, something deeper appears. A question, not about success, not about money, not even about others, but about you. Have I lived in peace, or have I just been running? Old age is not painful because of time. It becomes painful because of unresolved attachment. And thousands of years ago, Gautama Buddha revealed something most people still ignore. A secret so simple, yet so powerful, that it can turn fear into peace, loneliness into freedom, and aging into awakening. If you understand this, your old age will not be a burden. It will become your greatest liberation. The illusion you carry into old age. Most people believe that old age is difficult because the body begins to weaken, because energy fades, because time slowly limits what once felt limitless. But if you look closely, if you truly observe people who are growing old, you will notice something far more powerful and far more painful than physical decline. And that is the silent weight of the mind, the invisible burden of everything they have carried for decades without ever questioning whether it was truly theirs to carry in the first place. From a very young age, without even realizing it, you begin building an identity piece by piece, moment by moment, experience by experience, and each piece feels important. Each piece feels like it defines who you are. So you hold on to it, you protect it, you nurture it. And over time, it becomes the story you tell yourself about your life, the story you defend, the story you cannot imagine living without. And this story is built from many layers, from relationships that made you feel loved, from achievements that made you feel valuable, from failures that shaped your fears, from memories that gave you meaning, and slowly, without awareness, you begin to believe that this collection of experiences is you. You say, "This is my family, this is my success, this is my reputation, this is my past, this is my identity." And the deeper you go into life, the more tightly you hold on to these things because they give you a sense of stability, they give you a sense of control, they give you a sense that you are someone solid, someone defined, someone real. But what you do not see, what most people never stop to question, is that everything you are holding on to is constantly changing, constantly shifting, constantly moving beyond your control, and yet you continue to treat it as permanent. This is where the illusion begins, not in old age, but long before it. When you start believing that something temporary can give you permanent security, when you start believing that people will always remain the same, that roles will always stay fixed, that life will continue to follow the patterns you have become comfortable with, and because of this belief, you invest yourself deeply into things that were never meant to last forever. Then, slowly, almost silently, life begins to change its direction, not suddenly, not violently, but gradually, in ways that are easy to ignore at first. Your children begin to grow into their own lives. Your role in the world begins to shift. The recognition you once received becomes less frequent. The people who once depended on you begin to rely on themselves, and the identity you spent years building starts to loosen its grip. Not because you failed, not because you did something wrong, but because change is the nature of existence. And yet, even when everything around you is changing, the mind resists. The mind refuses to accept that what it held so tightly was never meant to stay. And instead of flowing with life, instead of understanding this natural movement, it begins to cling even harder. It begins to replay memories. It begins to compare the present with the past. It begins to ask questions like, why is this happening? Why is everything slipping away? Why do I feel like I am losing myself? But here is the truth that Gautama Buddha revealed. a truth that is simple yet deeply unsettling for those who are not ready to see it. You were never those things you are afraid of losing. You were never your roles. You were never your achievements. You were never your relationships. You were only attached to them, and attachment creates the illusion that something outside of you defines who you are. Old age does not take away your identity. It exposes that your identity was never stable to begin with. It shows you that everything you relied on was temporary, and for someone who has spent a lifetime believing in permanence, this realization feels like loss. It feels like emptiness. It feels like something is being taken away, when, in reality, nothing is being taken, only the illusion is dissolving. This is why two people can reach old age in completely different ways. One becomes bitter, restless, filled with regret, constantly looking back, constantly wishing things were the way they used to be, while the other becomes calm, peaceful, deeply content, not because their life was easier, not because they experienced less loss, but because they understood something earlier, something most people ignore until it is too late. They understood that holding on creates suffering, and letting go creates freedom. But letting go is not easy when you have spent your entire life holding on. It feels unnatural, it feels uncomfortable, it feels like you are giving up something important. And this is why most people resist it. They continue to hold on to memories, onto identities, onto expectations, even when it is causing them pain, because the mind prefers familiar suffering over unfamiliar peace. Old age then becomes a mirror, a very honest and unavoidable mirror, showing you everything you have been carrying, everything you have been clinging to, everything you have refused to release. And for many, this reflection is overwhelming because it reveals not just what they have lost, but what they never truly understood. And yet, within this realization, there is also an opportunity, a quiet, powerful opportunity that only old age can offer, because when everything external begins to fade, when distractions lose their intensity, when the world no longer demands the same level of attention from you, you are finally left with yourself, not the identity you created, not the roles you played, but the raw experience of being. And in that space, if you are willing to see clearly, if you are willing to question deeply, if you are willing to release what was never truly yours, something extraordinary begins to happen. The fear starts to loosen, the resistance begins to soften, and slowly, almost gently, you begin to understand that you were never losing yourself. You were only losing what you thought you were, and in that realization, the first step toward peace is born. Why attachment becomes more painful with age. If you observe your life carefully, if you look back not just at what happened, but at how you felt through different stages of your journey, you will begin to notice a pattern that most people never consciously recognize, a pattern that quietly shapes their happiness when they are young and slowly transforms into their suffering as they grow older. And that pattern is the way attachment evolves over time, the way something that once felt like joy slowly turns into something heavy, something difficult, something that begins to weigh on the heart in ways that are hard to explain but impossible to ignore. When you are young, attachment feels beautiful, it feels necessary, it feels like the very foundation of life itself, because everything is expanding, everything is opening, everything feels like it is coming toward you rather than moving away from you. You form relationships and they feel exciting. You chase goals and they feel meaningful. You build dreams and they give you direction. And in that stage of life, attachment does not feel like a burden. It feels like purpose. It feels like connection. It feels like you are becoming something more with every step you take. You attach to people because they make you feel alive. You attach to achievements because they make you feel valuable. You attach to your identity because it gives you a sense of control. And all of this feels natural. All of this feels right. because life at that stage supports your illusions. It allows you to believe that what you are building will stay, that what you are holding will remain, that what you love will not change in ways that you cannot control. And so you continue, without questioning, without doubting, without seeing the deeper truth behind what is happening. But time does not stop, and slowly, almost invisibly at first, the direction of life begins to shift. What was once expanding begins to contract. What was once coming toward you begins to move away from you, and the attachments that once felt light and joyful begin to reveal their other side, a side that was always there but hidden beneath the excitement of growth and possibility, a side that only becomes visible when change begins to take what you once believed was permanent. In old age, attachment no longer feels like joy. It begins to feel like fear. And this transformation is not sudden. It does not happen overnight. It builds gradually, over years, over decades, as you begin to notice that the things you once relied on are no longer as stable as they seemed. The people you once felt inseparable from begin to walk their own paths. The roles that once defined your place in the world begin to fade. The recognition you once received becomes less frequent, and the future that once felt full of possibilities begins to feel uncertain and limited. And in that space, something begins to tighten within you. Something begins to resist, because the mind has been conditioned for so long to hold on, to preserve, to maintain, and now it is being faced with a reality where holding on no longer works the way it once did. And this is where attachment reveals its true nature, not as love, not as connection, but as dependence, as a deep and often unconscious need for things to remain the way they were. You begin to fear losing the people you care about, not just physically but emotionally. You begin to fear being forgotten, being left behind, becoming irrelevant in a world that once revolved around your presence. And this fear is not always spoken. It is not always visible on the surface, but it is felt deeply, in quiet moments, in long silences, in the spaces where the mind begins to wander and reflect. This is why old age can feel heavy for so many, not because life is unfair, not because suffering suddenly appears without reason, but because the attachments that were never questioned are now being challenged by reality itself, and the mind does not know how to respond. It only knows how to hold on tighter, even when holding on is what is causing the pain. Gautama Buddha described attachment in a way that is both simple and profound. He compared it to holding something that burns, something that feels manageable at first, something that you believe you can control, but over time, the longer you hold on to it, the deeper the pain becomes. And yet, instead of releasing it, most people continue to grip it even tighter, because they believe that letting go would mean losing something important. But the truth is the opposite. The pain is not in letting go. The pain is in refusing to let go. The suffering does not come from change. It comes from resisting change. And this is why attachment becomes more painful with age, because the more life shows you that everything is temporary, the more the mind tries to deny it, the more it tries to cling to what is already slipping away. You replay memories, you revisit moments from the past, you compare what is with what was, and in doing so, you create a constant tension between reality and expectation, between what is happening and what you wish was happening. And this tension becomes exhausting. It becomes something that quietly drains your peace without you even realizing it. At the same time, there is another layer to this suffering, a deeper layer that is often overlooked, and that is the attachment to identity, the attachment to the version of yourself that you have spent years building, the person you believed you were, the roles you played, the importance you held in the lives of others. And when those roles begin to fade, when that identity begins to dissolve, it can feel as if you are disappearing, as if something essential is being taken away from you. But what is really happening is not loss. It is revelation. It is the gradual uncovering of a truth that was always present but never fully seen. The truth that who you are is not defined by what you do, not defined by who you are to others, not defined by the stories you have told yourself, but something much deeper, something that does not depend on external conditions, something that remains even when everything else changes. And yet, to see this clearly requires something most people are not prepared for. It requires the courage to question everything you have held onto, everything you have believed about yourself, everything you have assumed to be permanent. And this is why many people continue to suffer, because it feels easier to hold on to familiar pain than to face the unknown freedom that comes with letting go. Old age, then, is not just a stage of life. It is a turning point, a moment where the truth becomes impossible to ignore, where the illusions begin to dissolve, whether you are ready or not, and in that moment, you are faced with a choice that will define whether your later years are filled with peace or filled with struggle. You can continue to hold on, to resist, to fight against the natural flow of life, to try to preserve what cannot be preserved, and in doing so, you will find yourself becoming more restless, more anxious, more disconnected from the present moment. Or you can begin to understand, to observe, to slowly release the grip that has been causing the pain all along, and in doing so, you will discover something unexpected, something quiet yet deeply transformative. You will discover that peace was never in what you were holding onto. It was in the space that opens when you finally let go. And this realization, this shift from holding to releasing, from resisting to accepting, is where the journey toward true peace in old age truly begins. The truth about letting go. There is a moment in life, a quiet moment that does not arrive with noise or warning, a moment that most people overlook because it does not demand attention. Yet it carries the potential to transform everything, and that moment is when you begin to question what it truly means to let go. Not as an idea, not as something you have heard before, but as a direct experience within your own life, within your own mind, within the way you relate to everything around you. For most of your life, letting go feels like loss. It feels like something is being taken away from you, something valuable, something meaningful, something that once gave your life a sense of purpose and direction. And because of this perception, the mind naturally resists it. It avoids it. It delays it. It convinces itself that holding on is the safer choice, that maintaining control is the wiser path, that preserving what you have is the only way to remain whole. But if you look deeply, if you observe not just your actions but the subtle movements of your mind, you will begin to see that this resistance is not protecting you, it is limiting you, it is keeping you bound to a cycle that quietly creates suffering, a cycle where you are constantly trying to hold on to what is already changing, constantly trying to fix what is naturally moving, constantly trying to make permanent what was never designed to stay. Gautama Buddha did not teach letting go as an act of rejection. He did not say to abandon life, to withdraw from experience, or to disconnect from the world. Instead, he pointed to something far more subtle and far more profound. He pointed to understanding, to seeing things clearly as they are, without illusion, without distortion, without the need to control or possess them. Letting go, in its truest form, is not about losing something. It is about no longer trying to own what was never yours to begin with. It is about recognizing that everything you experience, every relationship, every moment, every feeling, every phase of life, arises and passes according to its own nature, not according to your desire, not according to your plans, not according to your expectations. When you do not understand this, you cling, you grasp, you hold tightly, and in that holding, you create tension, you create resistance, you create a constant struggle between what is and what you wish it to be. And this struggle becomes so familiar that you begin to think it is normal. You begin to believe that life is supposed to feel this way, that peace is something distant, something rare, something that only appears under perfect conditions. But when understanding begins, when you start to see clearly, something shifts in a way that cannot be forced, in a way that cannot be imitated, in a way that arises naturally from insight. And in that shift, you no longer feel the same urge to hold on, not because you are trying to let go, but because you see that there is nothing to hold on to. You begin to notice that every experience, no matter how beautiful or painful, has a beginning and an end. You begin to see that emotions rise and fall like waves, that thoughts appear and disappear without your control, that even the strongest attachments weaken over time. And this observation is not intellectual. It is not something you simply think about. It becomes something you feel, something you witness directly within your own awareness. And as this understanding deepens, the grip of attachment begins to loosen, not abruptly, not completely at once, but gradually, gently, like a hand that has been tightly closed for years, slowly beginning to open. And with that opening comes a sense of lightness, a sense of space, a sense that something within you is no longer burdened in the same way it once was. This is why letting go is often misunderstood, because people think it requires effort, they think it requires force, they think it requires discipline in the sense of pushing something away, but true letting go does not come from force. It comes from clarity. It comes from seeing so clearly that the need to hold on simply dissolves on its own. In old age, this understanding becomes even more important because life itself begins to demonstrate impermanence more directly, more visibly, more undeniably. The body changes, the environment changes, the relationships change, and if the mind continues to resist, if it continues to cling, the suffering becomes more intense, more persistent, more difficult to ignore. But if, instead of resisting, you begin to observe, if you begin to accept the nature of change without trying to control it, you discover something that most people spend their entire lives searching for without ever finding. You discover a peace that does not depend on circumstances, a peace that does not require everything to go your way, a peace that remains even when life is uncertain, even when things are not as you expected them to be. Letting go then becomes not an action, but a state of being, a way of relating to life where you are fully present, fully engaged, yet not bound by the need to possess or control what you experience. You can love without clinging. You can care without fear. You can participate in life without becoming trapped by it. And this is where true freedom begins. Not the freedom of having everything you want, but the freedom of not needing everything to be a certain way. The freedom of being at ease with change. The freedom of allowing life to unfold without constant resistance. Old age, when seen through this understanding, transforms completely. It is no longer a stage of loss. It becomes a stage of release. A stage where the layers of attachment that have built up over a lifetime can finally begin to dissolve. Not through force, not through struggle, but through insight, through awareness, through the quiet realization that what you were holding on to was never truly yours. And in that realization, something extraordinary emerges, something that cannot be taken away, something that does not depend on time, something that does not fade with age, and that is a deep, unshakable peace. A peace that arises not from holding on, but from finally understanding how to let go. Solitude is not loneliness. There is a fear that quietly follows most people throughout their lives, a fear that does not always appear on the surface, a fear that often hides behind busy schedules, constant conversations, endless responsibilities, and the need to always be surrounded by something or someone. And that fear is the fear of being alone, not just physically alone, but alone with oneself, alone with one's thoughts, alone without distraction, without noise, without the presence of others to reflect back a sense of identity. When you are young, this fear is easy to ignore, because life is full, it is crowded, it is constantly moving. There are people to meet, places to go, roles to fulfill, goals to chase, and in that movement, you rarely find yourself truly alone. Even when you are physically by yourself, your mind is occupied, your attention is directed outward, your sense of self is continuously reinforced by interactions, by validation, by the subtle but constant confirmation that you exist in relation to others. You become a reflection of your environment, a reflection of how others see you, how they respond to you, how they define your role in their lives, and without realizing it, your identity becomes deeply connected to this external feedback, to the presence of others, to the sense that you matter because you are seen, because you are needed, because you are part of something beyond yourself. But as life progresses, as time moves forward, as circumstances change, this external structure begins to shift, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly, and then more noticeably, more undeniably. The people who once filled your days become less present. The roles that once demanded your attention begin to fade. The responsibilities that once gave your life structure begin to loosen their hold, and in their place, something unfamiliar begins to emerge. Space, silence, solitude. And for many, this is where discomfort begins, not because solitude is inherently painful, but because they have never learned how to be with themselves without distraction, without external validation, without the constant reinforcement of identity that comes from being needed by others. What they experience in that silence is not peace, but restlessness, not calmness, but unease, not clarity, but a flood of thoughts, memories, regrets, and unanswered questions that have been quietly accumulating beneath the surface for years, waiting for a moment when the noise would finally subside and they would be forced to face what they have been avoiding. This is why solitude is often mistaken for loneliness, because when the mind is untrained, when it has spent a lifetime seeking fulfillment outside, when it has never developed the ability to rest within itself, being alone feels like something is missing. It feels like an absence. It feels like a lack. And the immediate reaction is to escape, to fill the silence, to find something, anything, that can distract from the discomfort of simply being. But what if this discomfort is not a problem? What if it is an invitation? Gautama Buddha pointed toward a truth that most people overlook, a truth that becomes especially important in old age, and that is the understanding that everything you seek outside of yourself, every form of validation, every sense of identity, every feeling of completeness, is temporary, unstable, and ultimately unable to provide lasting peace, because it depends on conditions that are constantly changing. When those conditions begin to fade, when the external sources of identity begin to dissolve, what remains is not emptiness, but an opportunity to discover something that was always there but never fully recognized, something that does not depend on others, something that does not require constant reinforcement, something that exists independently of roles, relationships, and external circumstances. And that is your own awareness. Solitude, when understood correctly, is not the absence of connection, it is the presence of a deeper connection, a connection with your own mind, your own being, your own existence, without the filters, without the distractions, without the constant need to become something in the eyes of others. In this space, if you are willing to stay, if you are willing to observe without reacting, without immediately trying to escape, something begins to change. The initial discomfort starts to soften, the restless thoughts begin to slow, the need for constant stimulation begins to fade, and gradually you begin to experience something that may have been unfamiliar for most of your life. Stillness. Not forced stillness, not silence created by external conditions, but an inner stillness that arises naturally when the mind is no longer chasing, no longer resisting, no longer trying to fill every moment with activity or noise. And within that stillness, a different kind of presence emerges, a presence that is not dependent on what is happening outside, a presence that remains steady even when circumstances change, even when people come and go, even when life moves in directions you did not expect. This is the transformation that solitude offers, not as an escape from the world, but as a deeper way of being in it, a way of existing where you are no longer defined by external roles, no longer dependent on constant interaction, no longer searching for completeness in places where it cannot be found. Old age, then, becomes a unique and powerful opportunity because it naturally creates the conditions for this transformation. It reduces the distractions, it slows the pace of life, it brings you face to face with yourself in a way that earlier stages of life often do not allow. And while many see this as a loss, as something to be feared, it can instead be seen as a doorway into a level of understanding and peace that is rarely accessed in the busyness of youth. But walking through this doorway requires a shift. It requires letting go of the belief that being alone means being incomplete. It requires releasing the idea that your worth is tied to how much you are needed by others. It requires the courage to sit with yourself without immediately seeking distraction, without immediately trying to fill the silence, because it is in that silence that clarity arises. It is in that stillness that the mind begins to settle. It is in that space that you begin to see yourself not as a collection of roles and identities, but as awareness itself, as something deeper, something more fundamental, something that has always been present but rarely acknowledged. And when this understanding deepens, loneliness loses its power, because you no longer feel like something is missing, you no longer feel like you need something outside to complete you. You begin to experience a sense of wholeness that is not dependent on conditions, a sense of peace that is not easily disturbed. You can still connect with others, you can still engage with life, you can still appreciate relationships and experiences, but you are no longer bound by them. You are no longer defined by them. You are no longer afraid of their absence. This is the difference between loneliness and solitude. One is rooted in lack, the other in completeness. One creates suffering, the other opens the door to peace. And understanding this difference is one of the most important shifts that can happen in old age. Because when you are no longer afraid of being alone, you are no longer controlled by the need to avoid it. And when you are no longer controlled by that need, something profound happens. You become free. Free from the constant search for validation. Free from the fear of being forgotten. Free from the belief that your value depends on your role in the lives of others. And in that freedom, in that quiet, steady presence, old age is no longer something to endure. It becomes something to embrace, a stage of life where the deepest truths can finally be seen, where the mind can finally rest, where peace is no longer something you chase, but something you naturally embody. The practice that brings real peace. There comes a point in life where understanding alone is no longer enough, where hearing truths, reflecting on ideas, and even agreeing with them internally does not fully transform the way you experience your reality, because no matter how clearly something is explained, if it is not lived, if it is not practiced, if it is not directly experienced within your own awareness, it remains distant, it remains theoretical, it remains something you know but do not embody. And this is why so many people reach old age with knowledge but without peace, with understanding but without stillness, with wisdom in words but not in experience. For years, even decades, the mind has been conditioned to move outward, to seek, to chase, to react, to compare, to remember, to anticipate, to build narratives, to create identities, to hold on to experiences. And this constant movement becomes so natural that you begin to believe it is simply the way the mind is, that restlessness is normal, that overthinking is unavoidable, that inner noise is just a part of being alive. And because of this belief, you rarely question it, you rarely step back and observe it, you rarely consider that there might be another way of being. But the truth that Gautama Buddha pointed to was not just about understanding life. It was about transforming the way you experience it, not by changing external circumstances, but by changing your relationship with your own mind, by shifting from being controlled by your thoughts to becoming aware of them, by moving from constant reaction to quiet observation. And this shift, although simple in principle, requires something most people are not used to offering themselves: stillness. Not the stillness of the body alone, but the stillness of attention, the willingness to pause, to stop chasing every thought, to stop following every memory, to stop reacting to every feeling, and instead, to simply observe, to sit with what is present without trying to change it, without trying to escape it, without trying to control it. At first, this feels uncomfortable, even unnatural, because the mind has been trained for so long to avoid stillness, to fill every moment with something, anything, that prevents it from facing itself directly. And when you finally stop, when you finally allow yourself to be present without distraction, everything that was hidden begins to surface. Thoughts become louder, emotions become more noticeable, the past reappears, the future demands attention, and it can feel overwhelming, as if the mind has become more chaotic rather than more peaceful. But this is not chaos being created. This is chaos being revealed. It was always there, quietly running in the background, influencing your reactions, shaping your perceptions, guiding your choices. And only now, in the absence of distraction, are you able to see it clearly. This is where most people stop. This is where they believe that stillness is not for them, that peace is not possible, that the mind is simply too restless, too conditioned, too difficult to observe without getting lost in it. And so they return to distraction, they return to noise, they return to the familiar patterns that keep them occupied, but never truly at ease. But if you stay, if you remain present, if you allow the mind to reveal itself without interference, something begins to shift, slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. The intensity of thoughts begins to soften, the urgency behind them begins to fade, the need to react to every mental movement begins to weaken, and in that space, a new experience begins to emerge. Awareness. Not as an idea, but as a direct reality. The realization that you are not your thoughts, that you are not the constant stream of memories, worries, and narratives that pass through your mind, but the one who is aware of them, the silent observer that remains unchanged, even as everything within the mind continues to move and evolve. This realization is not something you force, it is something you discover, something that becomes evident through observation, through patience, through the simple act of paying attention without judgment, without resistance, without attachment to what is being observed. And as this awareness deepens, the relationship with your thoughts begins to change. They no longer feel as overwhelming, as controlling, as defining as they once did. You begin to see them as temporary events rather than absolute truths, as movements within the mind rather than reflections of who you are. And this creates space, a space between you and your thoughts, a space where choice becomes possible, where you are no longer automatically pulled into every reaction, every emotion, every mental pattern. This is the foundation of inner peace, not the absence of thoughts, not the elimination of emotions, but the ability to remain present without being consumed by them, the ability to experience life without becoming entangled in every passing mental event. In old age, this practice becomes even more powerful. Because the external world naturally slows down, the demands decrease, the opportunities for quiet reflection increase, and what once felt like emptiness can become a fertile ground for deep awareness, for inner clarity, for a kind of peace that does not depend on activity or achievement. You begin to sit more, not out of boredom, but out of understanding. You begin to observe more, not out of effort, but out of curiosity. You begin to notice the subtle movements of the mind, the way thoughts arise, the way they pass, the way they try to pull you into their stories, and instead of following them, you remain, you watch, you allow them to come and go without interference. And in that allowing, something extraordinary begins to happen. The mind, which once felt like a source of endless noise, begins to quiet down, not completely, not permanently, but enough for you to experience moments of true stillness, moments where there is no urgency, no resistance, no need to be anywhere else or become anything else. These moments may be brief at first, but they carry a depth that is unmistakable, a sense of peace that feels different from anything you have experienced before, not because it is new, but because it has always been there, hidden beneath the constant movement of the mind, waiting to be uncovered. This is why practice is essential, not as a discipline imposed from the outside, but as a natural response to understanding, because once you begin to taste this stillness, once you begin to experience this awareness, something within you recognizes its value, recognizes its truth, and you are drawn to it, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to return to that state of clarity and peace. Over time, this practice begins to extend beyond moments of sitting, beyond periods of intentional stillness. It begins to influence the way you move through your day, the way you respond to situations, the way you relate to others, the way you experience change, and gradually, the line between practice and life begins to dissolve. You are no longer only aware when you sit quietly. You are aware when you speak, when you listen, when you walk, when you reflect, when you face challenges, when you experience joy. And this continuous awareness creates a stability that is not easily shaken, a presence that remains even in the midst of uncertainty. Old age, when supported by this practice, transforms into something profoundly different from what most people expect. It is no longer defined by loss or limitation, but by depth, by clarity, by a growing sense of freedom from the patterns that once caused suffering. You no longer depend on external conditions to feel at ease. You no longer rely on constant stimulation to avoid discomfort. You no longer fear the quiet moments because you have discovered what exists within them. And what exists within them is not emptiness. It is peace. A peace that was never created. A peace that was never lost. A peace that was only waiting for you to stop long enough to notice it. Accepting impermanence without fear. There is one truth that quietly exists beneath every experience you have ever had. A truth so constant, so undeniable, that it shapes every moment of your life, whether you are aware of it or not. And yet it is also the one truth that the human mind resists the most, avoids the most, and struggles to fully accept, not because it is complicated, not because it is hidden, but because it challenges the very way we have learned to see the world. And that truth is simple. Everything changes. From the moment you are born, change begins, not in dramatic ways at first, not in ways that immediately capture your attention, but in subtle, continuous movements that gradually shape your existence. Your body grows, your thoughts evolve, your environment shifts, your relationships form and dissolve, and all of this happens so naturally, so seamlessly, that you rarely stop to question it. You rarely pause to consider what it truly means, because during the early stages of life, change feels like progress. It feels like movement towards something. It feels like an expansion of possibilities. But as time moves forward, as you begin to experience not only beginnings, but also endings, not only growth but also decline. The perception of change begins to shift. What once felt like opportunity begins to feel like loss. What once felt like excitement begins to feel like uncertainty. And, slowly, without fully realizing it, the mind begins to develop a quiet resistance to change, a subtle but persistent desire for things to remain as they are, for moments to last longer, for people to stay the same, for life to follow a predictable and controllable path. This resistance does not appear as a clear thought. It does not announce itself openly, but it manifests in countless ways, in the way you hold on to memories, in the way you fear the unknown, in the way you feel discomfort when something familiar begins to shift. And over time, this resistance becomes so ingrained that you begin to see it as normal, as natural, as something that cannot be changed. But in old age, this resistance is brought to the surface in a way that can no longer be ignored, because the evidence of change becomes undeniable. The body no longer responds the way it once did. The energy that once felt abundant becomes limited. The roles that once defined your place in the world begin to fade. The people around you change, circumstances evolve, and life, in its quiet and relentless way, begins to show you that nothing remains the same. And this is where suffering either deepens or dissolves. Because if the mind continues to resist, if it continues to demand permanence from a reality that is inherently impermanent, the experience of old age becomes heavy. It becomes filled with frustration, with fear, with a constant sense that something is being taken away, that something is slipping beyond your control, that life is moving in a direction you did not choose. But if, instead of resisting, you begin to observe, if you begin to look at change not as an enemy but as a fundamental aspect of existence, something shifts, something profound, something that transforms the way you relate to everything. Gautama Buddha described this truth as Anicca, the understanding that all conditioned things are impermanent, that everything that arises will eventually pass, that nothing you experience can remain fixed or unchanging. And this was not meant to create fear, it was not meant to create sadness. It was meant to bring clarity, to bring freedom, to release the mind from the impossible task of trying to hold on to what cannot be held. When you begin to truly understand impermanence, not just intellectually but through direct observation, you start to see life differently. You start to notice that every experience, no matter how small, follows the same pattern. It arises, it exists for a moment, and then it fades. A thought appears and disappears, a feeling comes and goes, a moment begins and ends, and this cycle is constant, uninterrupted, present in every aspect of your existence. At first, this realization can feel unsettling because it challenges the sense of stability that the mind has been relying on for so long. It removes the illusion of permanence. It exposes the fact that nothing can be fully controlled or preserved. And for a mind that seeks certainty, this can feel like losing ground, like stepping into something unknown and unpredictable. But if you stay with this understanding, if you allow it to unfold without resistance, something remarkable begins to happen. The same truth that once felt unsettling begins to feel liberating, because you start to see that if everything changes, then suffering too is not permanent. Fear is not permanent. Pain is not permanent. Nothing that arises can stay forever, and this includes the very experiences that the mind struggles against. You begin to release the need to control every outcome, because you see that control is limited. You begin to soften your grip on expectations, because you understand that life does not move according to your plans. You begin to accept endings without seeing them as failures, because you recognize that endings are not exceptions, they are part of the natural flow. Old age then becomes a teacher, not a punishment, not a decline to be feared, but a stage of life that reveals this truth more clearly than any other. a stage where impermanence is no longer hidden beneath the distractions of youth, but is visible in every aspect of your experience, inviting you, again and again, to see clearly, to understand deeply, to release the resistance that creates suffering. And as you begin to accept impermanence, not as an idea but as a lived reality, something within you begins to relax. The constant tension of trying to hold on to things begins to dissolve. The fear of losing begins to weaken. The need for certainty begins to fade. And in its place, a different quality of experience emerges. Acceptance. Not passive resignation, not giving up on life, but a deep alignment with the way life actually is. A willingness to allow things to arise and pass without constant interference, without constant struggle, without the need to make everything fit into a fixed and unchanging structure. This acceptance does not make you indifferent. It does not remove your ability to care, to love, to engage with life. In fact, it enhances it, because when you are no longer trying to control everything, you are able to experience things more fully, more deeply, more authentically. You appreciate moments without clinging to them. You connect with others without fearing their absence. You engage with life without being overwhelmed by its changes. There is also a deeper layer to this understanding, one that becomes especially significant in old age, and that is the awareness of mortality, the recognition that life itself, like everything else, is impermanent, that your time in this form, in this body, in this particular experience of existence is limited. And while this realization can be uncomfortable, it also carries a powerful potential, because when you truly see that life is finite, that it is not endless, that it will eventually come to an end, your perspective begins to shift. The things that once seemed so important lose some of their weight. The worries that once consumed your attention begin to feel less significant. The need to hold on to every detail begins to soften, and instead, a sense of presence begins to grow. You begin to value the moment not because it will last, but because it will not. You begin to appreciate life not in spite of its impermanence, but because of it. And in this shift, fear begins to transform. It does not disappear completely, but it loses its grip. It no longer dominates your experience. It no longer controls your actions. It becomes something that can be observed, something that can be understood, something that can be allowed to arise and pass like everything else. This is the true acceptance of impermanence, not a forced belief, not a concept you repeat to yourself, but a direct, lived understanding that changes the way you experience reality, that frees you from the constant struggle against change, that opens the door to a deeper, more stable peace. Old age, when approached with this understanding, is no longer a stage of fear. It is a stage of clarity, a stage where the illusions that once seemed so real begin to dissolve, where the truth of impermanence becomes not something to resist, but something to align with, something to embrace, something to learn from. And in that alignment, in that acceptance, in that deep and quiet understanding, you begin to experience a kind of peace that does not depend on things staying the same, a peace that remains even as everything continues to change, a peace that is not fragile, not temporary, but rooted in the very nature of reality itself. The final realization: nothing was ever yours. There comes a moment, not defined by age, not marked by any external event, but by a quiet shift within, a moment when everything you have believed about life, about yourself, about what you own and what you are, begins to loosen, begins to soften, begins to reveal itself in a way that is both simple and deeply transformative. And in that moment, a realization arises, not as a thought, not as an idea, but as something you feel with complete clarity. Nothing was ever yours. For most of your life, this statement feels uncomfortable, even unsettling, because everything you have built your identity around is based on the idea of possession, the idea that this is my life, my family, my success, my memories, my story, and through this language, through this constant reinforcement, the mind creates a sense of ownership, a sense that you are the center of everything you experience, that you are the one holding it all together. But if you look closely, if you observe deeply, if you move beyond the surface of these assumptions, you begin to see something different, something that was always present but rarely acknowledged. You begin to see that everything you call yours has come and gone on its own terms. People entered your life without your control and left in ways you could not always predict. Experiences arose and passed, regardless of how tightly you tried to hold on to them. Thoughts appeared in your mind without invitation and disappeared without permission. Even your body, which feels like the most personal and permanent aspect of your existence, has been changing continuously, moment by moment, beyond your direct control. Gautama Buddha pointed to this, not to create a sense of loss, but to dissolve the illusion that creates suffering, the illusion that you can possess what is inherently unpossessable, the illusion that you can fix what is naturally fluid, the illusion that you can build a permanent identity in a reality that is constantly changing. When you do not see this, you cling, you grasp, you try to hold everything together, and in that effort, you create tension, you create fear, you create a constant sense that something could be taken away at any moment, because deep down, beneath all the beliefs and assumptions, there is an awareness that nothing is truly stable, that everything is subject to change. And this awareness, when resisted, becomes anxiety, becomes insecurity, becomes the underlying discomfort that follows you through life. But when you begin to see clearly, when you begin to understand that nothing was ever yours in the way you imagined, something begins to shift, not as a loss, but as a release, not as something being taken away, but as something being lifted. The weight of ownership, the pressure to maintain, the constant effort to control and preserve, all of it begins to dissolve. You start to realize that life was never something you were meant to own. It was something you were meant to experience. And this shift changes everything, because when you no longer see things as possessions, you no longer fear losing them in the same way. You can appreciate what is present without clinging to it. You can engage with life without trying to control every outcome. You can love without the constant fear of separation. You can exist without the need to define yourself through what you have or what you have been. Old age becomes the perfect stage for this realization, because by this point, life has already shown you the truth again and again. It has shown you that things change, that roles fade, that identities shift, that nothing remains fixed. And if you are willing to see it, if you are willing to accept it, if you are willing to move beyond the resistance that has been built over years, this stage of life offers something that earlier stages often do not: clarity. A clarity that is not clouded by endless ambition, not distracted by constant activity, not driven by the need to prove or achieve, but grounded in direct observation, in lived experience, in the simple yet profound recognition of how things truly are. And within this clarity, a deeper understanding begins to emerge, an understanding that goes beyond impermanence, beyond letting go, beyond even the idea of self. You begin to question not just what you have, but who you are, not just what you are holding on to, but who is holding on. You begin to observe that the sense of I, the feeling that there is a fixed, unchanging self at the center of your experience, is itself something that arises and passes, something that shifts depending on circumstances, something that is built from thoughts, memories, perceptions, and reactions, all of which are constantly changing. This insight is subtle, but incredibly powerful, because it reveals that even the one who is trying to control, The one who is trying to hold on, the one who is afraid of losing, is not as solid as it seems. It is a process, not a fixed entity, a flow of experiences rather than a permanent self. And when this is seen clearly, the need to control begins to fade, because there is no longer a fixed center that needs to be protected at all costs. There is no longer a rigid identity that must be maintained. There is only experience unfolding, moment by moment, without the constant pressure of ownership and control. This is where true freedom arises. Not the freedom of having everything you want, but the freedom from needing everything to be a certain way, the freedom from the illusion of ownership, the freedom from the constant effort to preserve what cannot be preserved. And in this freedom, something profound begins to take shape, a peace that is not dependent on circumstances, a stillness that is not disturbed by change, a sense of completeness that does not rely on external validation or internal narratives. Old age, in this light, is no longer something to fear. It is no longer a stage of decline or loss. It becomes a culmination, a point where the illusions that once guided your life can finally be seen for what they are, where the attachments that once caused suffering can finally be released, where the mind can finally rest in the understanding that nothing needed to be held on to in the first place. And in that rest, in that release, in that deep and quiet clarity, you discover something that was never affected by time, never changed by circumstances, never defined by roles or identities. A simple awareness, a presence, a peace that was always there, beneath the noise, beneath the struggle, beneath the endless movement of the mind. You do not create this peace. You uncover it. You do not achieve it. You return to it. And this is the final realization, not something distant, not something reserved for a few, but something available to anyone who is willing to see clearly, to let go deeply, to move beyond the illusions that have shaped their experience of life. Nothing was ever yours. And in understanding this, everything becomes lighter. Everything becomes freer. Everything becomes peaceful. One day, everything will become quiet. Not because the world has stopped, but because your role in it has changed. The noise that once filled your life, the constant movement, the endless chasing, it will all slow down. And in that silence, you will meet something you have been avoiding your entire life. Yourself. Not the version shaped by others, not the identity built from achievements, not the story created by memories, but something deeper, something that was always there, waiting behind the noise. And in that moment, there will be no more distractions, no more illusions to hide behind. Only one question will remain. Did you learn how to be at peace, or did you spend your whole life running from it? Gautama Buddha never promised a life without change. He never promised a life without loss, but he revealed something far greater. That peace was never found in holding on. It was found in understanding, in letting go, in seeing clearly. Because the truth is, you were never meant to control life. You were meant to experience it, without clinging, without fear, without illusion. Old age is not the end of life. It is the moment life reveals its deepest truth. And if you are ready to see it, you will realize something extraordinary. Nothing you feared losing was ever truly yours. And nothing that is truly you can ever be lost. So do not wait for old age to understand this. Do not wait for everything to fall away. Before you begin to see clearly, start now. Sit quietly. Observe your mind. Let go, just a little, and watch what happens. Because the peace you are searching for is not somewhere in the future. It has always been within you, waiting